Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Ethics of UBI Seminar's first public seminar, in which we will invite two guests. First of all, we're starting with Guy Standing, who is a professor, professorial research associate at SOAS University of London. He is a longtime researcher and advocate of UBI, probably one of the leading world figures in the UBI movement. He's a founding member and honorary co-president of the Basic Income Earth Network, which has been organizing internationally for basic income since the 1980s. And he is the author of more books than I can read, several dozen books, including, importantly for us, The Precariat, A New and Dangerous Class, The Corruption of Capitalism, The Plunder of the Commons, and Basic Income, A Guide for the Open-Minded. Guy Standing, welcome.
Lost you.
Welcome, Guy Standing.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Carl, and it's a pleasure to be here. I hope everybody can hear me clearly. And what I want to do in the next few minutes is give an ethical rationale for basic income. As Carl has just mentioned, I've been a proponent for many years, and I believe that the rationale for basic income is fundamentally ethical, not instrumental. It's also beneficial economically and instrumentally, but it's the ethical foundations that I wish to emphasize this afternoon. And I'd like to begin by talking about the commons and the very notion of common property. We go back to the base of common law, which was established with the Justinian Codex of AD 534. And very crucially for history, that codex has been the foundation stone of common law systems throughout history and the constitutions of all democracies. And it was taken forward into the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest of 1217, which I've used in the Plunder of the Commons as the foundation stone of that analysis. And essentially what Justinian law did was say that there are four types of property. There's the res privatae, private things, the res publicae, public things, the res nullius, things that belong to nobody, and the res communis, or often expressed as re communis omnium, things belonging to all of us as commoners. And the essence of common law and common property is that it belongs to every one of us equally. The word equally is very clear. And that it not only encompasses land, the sea, the air, the seabed, the minerals under the ground, but all the institutions that we inherit that have been built up and accepted as part of the commons. And that has been based on a concept of social memory. It was recognized as such, it's institutionalized as such, it's accepted as such through legislation and so on. And the first point is to differentiate common property rights from private property rights. And here we can draw on John Locke. Now, John Locke famously was regarded as the father of the US Constitution, the unofficial founding father of that Constitution. And he delineated and defended private property. And he was actually against redistribution of private property. But he crucially introduced three provisos that philosophers have discussed ad infinitum ever since. And the Lockean provisos are first and foremost what I call the sufficiency proviso, or the enough and as good. In other words, private individuals can appropriate land or resources from the commons only if enough and as good are left for others. Very crucial, very often neglected by neoliberals. So that is fundamentally a defense of the existence of the commons. His second proviso is often called the sustenance proviso, and it says that property owners have a moral duty to provide those without property enough to avoid extreme want. And the third proviso is called the spoilage proviso, which states that the property owner should not engross as much as he will from the commons, but only as much as he can enjoy. In other words, make use of himself. Now, of course, immediately you say those three provisos, I'm sure everybody knows that they've been abused, particularly in the period of what we call neoliberalism, that morphed into what I call rentier capitalism in my book, The Corruption of Capitalism. Now, the commons are the basis of Republican freedom. And I'll come back to that later. And the very important thing about the commons is that it is about inheritance of public wealth. And that leads to the fundamental argument for basic income. Because a basic income can be justified ethically from three dimensions. And the first one is about common justice. The income and wealth of all of us is far more to do with the efforts and achievements of the many, many generations that went before us than anything we do ourselves. If you accept that, and if you accept that private inheritance of private wealth and private property, which has been built up from taking from the commons, is accepted, private inheritance is accepted, then we should allow for public inheritance as well, in the form of a common dividend on the collective wealth of society. That principle for me is the bedrock of a justification for basic income. Because if you allow for common dividends, they have to be equal to everybody as an economic right. But when we think of common justice, we should also think of other forms of justice. I noticed that the Pope last year came out in favor of basic income, remarkable, and given the history of paternalism that the Catholic Church has represented. And essentially, Pope Francis said that, like we have been arguing within Bien for many years, I'm not religious, but if you are religious, you can argue that God has given us unequal talents, including the talent of making money. And a basic income is a matter of religious justice in compensating those who haven't been gifted with those particular talents. But a basic income would also be a matter of ecological justice. And this, of course, is fundamental in the 21st century, because we know that the wealthy and those who are taking from the commons through their polluting activity, diminishing the value of the commons, if you like, are getting away with it, while the poor, the low-income groups in every society, are those suffering the consequences of global warming, pollution, and ecological decay. So a basic income in that sense would be a matter of ecological justice. We need high carbon taxes. We need eco taxes of variety of types, but they are regressive in themselves. It will only become progressive and ecologically sustainable if there's a guarantee that all the revenue raised through those eco taxes are recycled in the form of common dividends or basic income. Then the whole system becomes progressive. And the final thing about justice is that in a capitalist economy, only private property and labor are rewarded unequally, unfairly, etc. But all the activities of commoning and work are ignored and not compensated at all. And during the pandemic, people have now come to realize more than they used to, more than they should have done many years ago, that unpaid work is the most essential work of all. And a basic income, in a sense, would compensate those who are not gaining income from labor or property to gain some part of the income. Now, the second ethical justification for moving towards a basic income is fundamentally about freedom. And I want to emphasize here, because it's vitally important for all of us in this evolving political debate around basic income, to emphasize a couple of other things before I go into the freedom issues. One is that none of us believe that a basic income is a panacea. None of us believe that it is a magic bullet that can solve all distributional problems and economic problems concerned with capitalism. It is part of a package. And as part of a package, it has to be seen in a context of other progressive policies needed at the same time. None of us should be put in the trap of thinking or pretending or being thought of as seeing it as a panacea. But the second ethical justification is about freedom. All political credos, all politicians say they believe in freedom. But what is freedom? There are three types of freedom that should be considered. The first is what I call libertarian freedom, the freedom to choose. That's why Milton Friedman came around to support some variants of basic income, because he said a market economy, a capitalist economy, can't function unless people can make rational decisions, and therefore they have to have a sort of basic income of some sort, access to material resources to make rational decisions. I can respect that position. It's not mine, but I can respect that position. The second type of freedom is not just being able to say no to an oppressive relationship, but also the liberal freedom of the freedom to be moral. That is a classic liberal principle. The freedom to be moral is to be able to make a moral decision because I believe it is right. And the person who is in chronic insecurity or in poverty or lacking access to resources cannot afford to be moral. They have to be opportunistic. They have to be under stress. And the freedom to be moral is supported by having a basic income. Then you can be responsible. You cannot be moral if a bureaucracy is telling you in order to get some benefits, you have to do X, Y, and Z. I'm not being moral then. I'm doing what I'm told. It's a paternalistic situation. And the third form of freedom is the one that we in Bien emphasize, or many of us in Bien emphasize above the other two, which is Republican freedom. And that is freedom from potential domination by figures in unaccountable authority. A woman is not free if she has to ask her husband or partner or father if she can do X or Y, even if she knows that 99% of the time he will say yes. A woman is only free if she can make that decision herself without fear of retribution and be able to do it independently. And that applies not just to women, but to everybody in general, but of course to women, because of historical reasons, it's a crucial type of freedom. And fundamentally, as a number of members of BIEN over the years have discussed, a basic income is also a lever of democratization. It gives you freedom to be a citizen and participate in public action in the sense that Hannah Arendt and the ancient Greeks understood that. And the third ethical reason for moving in the direction of a basic income as the anchor of a new social protection system is that it enhances basic security, almost by definition. I'm one of those who believes that we must be on the road to going to a basic income. We will not have it overnight. So we have to build it up and be constantly moving in the direction of ensuring that basic income is fundamentally provided. And basic security is a human need. It is also a public good. And it is a superior public good. A public good is a good that if you have it, it doesn't deprive other people of having it, unlike a private commodity. And a superior public good is one that where everybody has it, the value to each and every one of us goes up. And by way of conclusion, a basic security, the psychologists have shown, increases the mental bandwidth. If you're chronically insecure, your bandwidth shrinks, your IQ drops, and your ability to make good decisions, responsible decisions, diminishes. And it is evil of the state to expect people who are chronically insecure to be behaving rationally and with social responsibility. They only become accountable to the state if the state is making sure that they have basic security. And basic security is fundamentally the essence of what is needed in an era of pandemics and an era of chronic uncertainty, with unknown unknowns crowding in on us, where stress and anxiety develop from insecurities. So for me, leaving aside the effect on poverty, leaving aside the effect on inequalities, which are all very, very important, it's the ethical justification that I want us to emphasize today. So thank you very much for listening.
All right, thank you, Guy. Uh-oh, Guy is now frozen. Let's see, I don't think it's at our end. Okay,
I'm
you're
frozen.
unfrozen, Guy. You are unfrozen. Did you hear everything I said? Okay, good. Good, you didn't lose the transmission. All right, so let's go to comments. I will give the speakers prerogative of trying to help the audience emphasize this, saying that the idea of a commons is something that, of course, you trace through European political history. And I look at through anthropological discussion that most of the world actually the entire world was a commons for most of the time humans have been on this planet. And most native people treated it as a commons and thought of the land as something that could only be a commons. It was later peoples like the Romans who came up with these ideas of, well, that's one type of property. We can have these several other types of property. And you get people like John Locke, who is trying to justify political inequality, but doing it in such a way that actually, if you look into it more deeply, he is actually giving a lot of ammunition to people saying, well, the people who own the property of the world have not fulfilled their duties, because he's given these three provisos. And what he and his predecessor, Thomas Hobbes, both did was start out with this idea of a state of nature. It's like, well, you can live without private property or without a sovereign government the way those naked savages do. But of course, the lowliest civilized man is better off than the best off naked savage. So you're all better off. And they used this belief to say that all these provisos are satisfied. And then that gave them an excuse both to oppress native peoples whose land they were stealing, and Locke was endorsing this at the time, and to justify taking land from European peasants who actually, as you document in your book, Plunder the Commons, European peasants who'd had a lot of common access to land themselves, as did Americans at the time. There was a lot of common land for Americans, for white Americans to use at the time, not just the natives. And the idea of Locke is to take these things away, but actually these provisos are unfulfilled. If nothing else, the proviso gives an enormous argument for basic income, because people start off, their default position in the world is much worse off than these so-called naked savages that Locke and Hobbes were talking about. And that if we can't get people up to the way that they live, that they can live when there is no private property system and people hunt and gather and fish and farm and do whatever they will with the resources of the earth. If we can't get them up to that level, we owe them compensation. And if that compensation is to give them the kind of freedom that people who need resources to survive have when they have access to commons, it has to come in some unconditional form, like basic income. All right. So, Guy, you want to respond?
Yeah, I like to bring that up to the modern point, Carl, because essentially the commons historically have been taken, plundered by elites and establishments. They haven't gained them from merit-worthy activities. Fundamentally, the commons have been subject to encroachment, enclosure, colonization, and now privatization. And the commons has been turned into a rent extraction for capital. It's completely illegitimate. Mm-hmm. And what we're saying in this argument is that we should be compensated by gaining the rents from the deprivation of the commons, which would be put into a capital fund, a commons capital fund built up along the lines of the Norwegian or other capital funds, and preserved, the capital value preserved over time to satisfy what's called the intergenerational equity principle. If you took back the income from the people who've taken the commons and then distributed it to everybody today, that would be inequitable to future generations. So you have to preserve the capital value of the assets that are diminishing. But many forms of commons, of course, can be recycled. The income from taking back the rent can be recycled because they are replenishable, like the air or like the land. But I want to conclude with the following point, that most people think of the commons historically and the enclosure movements of various types against people who are peasants, against people who've been colonized. And I want to remind us all that the biggest single enclosure action in history took place in 1982. And that was UNCLOS. And UNCLOS basically enclosed 200 nautical miles from any coast and turned it into private property of the state that could then privatize it to capital. So we are seeing today 2/3 of the world's surface, the seas, being turned into the zone of rentier capitalism. And our commons in the sea, which our ancestors would have all just taken for granted as part of our commons, and everywhere, has been turned into private rent-seeking vast profits. And that is the basis where we need to get the rents back to be put into the capital fund. It's going to be the biggest source of income for a capital fund and then paying out common dividends in the years to come. And it's something that students who are thinking of doing research, it's an area which I've dealt with in my new book, which is about to come out on the Blue Commons, but it's an area of fascinating research opportunities, huge number of issues of private property rights, intellectual property rights, and so on, which I think is very closely linked to our debate on basic income.
All right. Thank you, Guy. Now, I have one of the graduate students in the class has prepared extended comments for you. That is Farkud Tersankulov. So take it away, Farkud.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, professors.
Good afternoon.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Professor Standing for his very productive work and brief description of pros and cons of basic income. Well, generally, all my ideas have been already discussed. However, I want to add some points as well. So in his book of basic income, Professor Standing discusses three main perspectives. Let's say benefits of UBI. They are justice, freedom, and security, which UBI can bring to people regardless of their age, gender, marital, and work status. And at the same time, he deals with the different objections that have been made to it, especially on affordability and the impact on labor supply of UBI. And he also looked at the practical and political challenges of implementation of UBI. So talking about the justice which UBI might bring, Professor states about it by quoting the words of Thomas Paine. UBA and money deviation, it's not a charity, but a right, not a bounty, but justice. Therefore, a basic income can thus be explained as a social dividend paid from the collective wealth of society. The fair division of commons of society and natural resources that belong to all people. It's essential to say that the dividends are universal, unconditional, regular, and at the same time, there is no, there is no behavioral condition requiring people to behave in a certain way and requiring them to use this money in the certain purposes in order to qualify for the basic income. However, to be honest, I personally believe that as a small impact of government and a slight control of money usage by people would make this program even more complete, because due to above mentioned actions, there would be even a small guarantee that people could use this money for a good intentions. Also, it's interesting to notice about that all above mentioned positive aspects of UBI toward the establishment of justice were debated between right and left libertarians. Both are based on the arguments that every individual should have self-ownership, and those they don't have a duty of helping to others except their own voluntary actions. However, the two factions differ in their attitude to natural resources and property. Both wings, left and right, believe that natural resources and land in particular are owned by no one, and furthermore, it's common, owned by all people. The next, talking about the next beneficial effect of UBI, it is that almost all proponents of basic income claim that it would enhance and give substance to freedom. When the basic needs of people for the food, shelter, and medicine are met via the money provided, people start obtaining freedom of education, freedom of thought and speech, freedom of religion, and etc. In his book, Professor Standing emphasizes several aspects of freedom effect of UBI. They are the freedom to choose a job, for example, to choose a job by not depending on the wage or other factors, the freedom of time for doing a creative work and activities of all kinds, the freedom to learn new skills, and the freedom to have a child without fear of financial instability. Whatever variant of freedom is exposed, a basic income would enhance it. However, on the other hand, there are also some contradictions between liberals and Republicans about this term. Professor describes it in the way that in the liberal tradition, a basic income would be both necessary and sufficient if it's high enough to meet the basic needs. In the Republican traditions, however, basic income would be necessary but not sufficient, as the institution policies would be needed properly to advance freedom. Nevertheless, according to all above mentioned aspects, it's clear that privileges that UBI might provide can become a very effective locomotive of progress of society. And to summarize, at the end, I want to shortly clarify my personal opinion. I think the UBI is a kind of tool which can be implemented and can play a very effective role in the social welfare of societies. But at the same time, I also believe that slight changes of structure, like a slight control of people's usage of money by government, would make this problem even more complete. But it's only my personal opinion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, Guy, would you like to respond?
Yeah, well, first of all, Farkud, thank you very much for that extended comment, and congratulate you for making it. It shows certainly that you've studied the book. I think by the tone of your voice, you're more of a paternalist than I am, in the sense that you think that the state is more benign than I might think. I don't know where you come from. I would be interested to know.
Yeah, I'm from Uzbekistan.
Uzbekistan. So you come from a long tradition of a very paternalistic state. So I understand your predicament. I personally agreed with what you were saying before you reached your conclusion, which is that a basic income is a necessary policy for freedom, but it's not sufficient. And what I've always argued, and I think you'll agree that it's in that book and others, is that there are two meta securities needed for freedom. One is basic security and access to resources, which is a basic income, and the other is voice, the existence of agency, collective voice and individual voice. Because without institutions to represent us, we will all remain vulnerable. So we need collective and individual voice. And that was one reason why when we did our big basic income pilot in India, I insisted that we divided up the communities in 4 communities. There was just a basic income provided to thousands of people. And another 4 communities, there was a basic income plus a representative organization called Sewa operating in those communities on behalf of the citizens of those communities, and what differences that makes. And I think it does make a difference. But the last point I want to say in response to your comments, and I argue this in the book, there is only one condition that I would entertain as a leverage and giving a basic income. And that was the condition that was actually developed in ancient Greece under Pericles in AD 403. And that was that a basic income was provided not so much as a condition on participating in the life of the polis and participating as a citizen in a democracy, but as a reward for doing that. So I would entertain a linking of basic income with a moral commitment being made by the individuals to participate in the democracy of the community and the country. I think that is a defendable position. I don't believe in any other behavioral conditions because they interfere with selective activities and the rest of it. But I would entertain that because we have a crisis of democracy and deliberative democracy at the moment. We're seeing populism, autocrats, and manipulation through the media, et cetera, and it's one of the big crises of our era. And so if there was a formal linkage there, I would allow for it. I don't know how others would think about this, but it's an issue worth contemplating.
All right, thanks. Now, I have some more extended comments from Jui Patil. Jui, please take it away.
Yeah, hello, good afternoon, Professor, and good afternoon, everyone. There's nothing much that I have to say today because the book is pretty much very clear. And I just had 3 questions. The first one is how.
Okay, let's take these one at a time since it's so well divided into 3 questions. One question, Guy answers. Maybe we'll all discuss or whatever, but then we'll go to the next question. Guy answers and or maybe we'll go right. Okay, so one at a time. Okay, number 1.
Yeah.
I don't mind.
So the first one is how can we implement UBI, or how can it be implemented considering all the factors like population, and how can we apply in this evolving global economy?
Okay. Can I ask you, Joy, where do you come from?
Yeah, I come from India.
Which part of India?
Maharashtra.
Okay. Now, we did a pilot. We've done 3 pilots, basic income pilots in India. And just before we were going to launch our big one in Madhya Pradesh, Sonia Gandhi, who was then president, and that was before Modi came in, she asked us to go to her house because she said, this is going to be a waste of money. People will spend it on alcohol and tobacco and will stop working. And we said, we do not believe this. And she said, also, you won't be able to implement it because the very, very few people have bank accounts and they won't be able to get the money. So we said to her, we have thought of all those things, and we believe that people may be poor, but they're not stupid. And we believe that they will find ways of implementing it and turning it to their advantage. We will now find out, we said. And we went to the rural areas of Madhya Pradesh, you may know it, and all of those areas are very poor, and most of them had no bank account, anything like that. We went to those villages and we said, we are going to give you a basic income and we're going to give you a card. And each month you will be able to show the card and you will get your basic income. But we said, within 3 months, you must open a bank account to get your basic income. People back in the cities said, they won't know what to do. Very quickly, within 2 months, 96% of those people had open bank accounts, right? And where we had, say we're working, in those 4 areas where the union was working, it was 98%, okay? Now, if you can get it implemented, and we had 6,000 people, right? If you can get it implemented, and another 6,000 as the control group, if you can implement it in such a poor area as there, you should be able to do it in many, many places. At the moment, I'm advising on a basic income scheme for Nepal. If you know anything about Nepal, you know that it's really lacking in infrastructure and so on. We've done basic income in Africa, big one going in Kenya at the moment, one we did in Namibia, and in many other places. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that when you have a new policy, most people can find the reasons why it shouldn't be done, why it can't be done. And then ingenuity comes and suddenly it's done. And for me, this is what is happening with basic income today. As Carl knows, in the United States at the moment, there are over 80 schemes of some sort related to basic income taking place. They're not this ideal model in any way. I'm advising on a big scheme in Barcelona and a big scheme in Wales. So we're seeing a quiet revolution taking place. And if you can imagine how I am feeling and how people like Carl are feeling, who've been working on this for many years and are seeing this taking shape in reality, you may appreciate how exciting it is. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, sir.
All right.
It
I think
does.
I'll go to your second question without going to a round discussion on this. So your second question.
Yeah. So the second question is particularly from the book, from the part the rentier economy. Giving the example of Bill Gates, it is mentioned that individual wealth owes more to luck, laws, regulations, inheritance, and fortunate timings than the individual's brilliance. So I want to ask that, is it not unfair to deny entirely that there is lack of brilliance? Like another person without the brilliance like Bill Gates couldn't have achieved all of this despite of all the resources available to him like they were available to Bill Gates. So do you think that we should just deny that individual brilliance is not playing a key role here?
I think we're mixing up some things here. If you have a market economy, no one, I think, is saying there will not be some inequalities. And some people make big contributions and some small contributions for which they gain extra income and wealth. But what I think has happened in the last 50 years is we've had a situation where rentier capitalism has evolved so that the return to property has dramatically increased. Bill Gates should go down and worship every morning, bending his knees in the direction of where I'm speaking outside Geneva. The reason is that in 1994, what became the World Trade Organization passed a piece of legislation called TRIPS. And TRIPS was a trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. And it was led by Pfizer, the chief executive of Pfizer, who also should be worshipping that treaty, that piece of legislation every day, worshipping on his knees. Because what it did is it globalized US intellectual property rights. It globalized the patent system and the copyright system and the industrial brand system. So that henceforth, if you filed an idea, it guaranteed the owner of that idea the 20 years of monopoly profits. Nobody else was allowed to produce what that idea has been filed as a patent. Now, we also have, in the case of pharmaceuticals, what's called an evergreening, so they can have an extra 20 years. And what this has done is create enormous rents flowing. Thomas Jefferson famously said, ideas should not be the subject of property, with which I agree. But they have been turned into private property. Now, Bill Gates made a pebble of a contribution to a Gibraltar of a structure of ideas. He came along when a whole lot of other people before him had made huge contributions to building that block. He came along and he put the cherry on the top and he gets the whole lot. Many of the people who contributed, many of the ideas that he drew from got nothing. But he patented it, just as others patented certain things, and Pfizer has patented their vaccines and denied the poor of the world access to the vaccine because they got a monopoly. So for me, I'm not against inequalities that are due to brilliant contributions, etc., but they have been exaggerated because they're a plunder of the commons. I'm all in favor of giving a prize for people who come up with great ideas. Okay, that's fine. But don't turn it into private property, monopolistic property for 20 years. It's ridiculous. So for me, it's a matter of dismantling that and getting back the rents to build this commons fund and then distribute in common dividends.
Okay, before we get to your third question, I want to a question that came in from YouTube. There's a bunch of questions from the YouTube audience. And this one from Eno Smith is, UBI is not compensation, is it? It is no payment. It's not compensation for unpaid work. It's not a swap. And Guy, how would you relate to that?
I use the word compensation in terms of religious justice. You know, that God gave unequal talents and common dividends would be a compensation to those who haven't got. I also use the term compensation in terms of pollution, greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions are caused mainly by the wealthy with their super yachts and frequent flights and all sorts of ways of pollution, which the poor suffer from in terms of ill health consequences and denial of space, denial of fresh air, etc. And in that sense, capturing the bits of the commons that they've taken and used and recycling them is a form of compensation. Okay, I believe that a basic income is an ethical imperative for the other reasons that I've discussed. But I think the word compensation in terms of deprivation of the commons in that double sense, taking of assets illegally or illegitimately and eating into our commons through pollution and so on, I think then the word compensation is acceptable.
Okay, Dewey, let's get
Now
to your
the third question from Dewey.
Yeah. So the last question. Basic income can enable everyone to buy time and become more flexible. It gives people much more freedom to conduct their own personal business, take more risks in order to grow themselves, and realize their own potential in a variety of things and in a variety of ways. But women often oppressed, particularly in more traditional societies, would get the opportunity to get a social standing and independence that they deserve. But then the question arises, in patriarchal societies, even if a woman is earning, the ultimate earning holder becomes the man. Because I have personally seen it in my country, this thing. But the family, so in such cases or in such families, and what assurance do we have that the basic income of that individual, be it a man or woman, then is utilized by him or her itself, and it is not misused by somebody else?
Okay, very good question. I don't think you can guarantee anything with one policy. A basic income is a very important emancipatory tool. You will see in the book that I argue that the emancipatory value of a basic income is greater than the monetary value of that basic income. And in our pilots in India, at the end, we asked every individual man and every individual woman, who benefited more, the men or the women, from having an individual basic income paid to each woman, each man separately? They could have said equally. And the answers were very striking. 3/4 of people said women benefited more than men. And that was the same said by women as by men. And I give you two examples of how the emancipatory value was enormously emotionally powerful for me. I went to one of the villages, which was a predominantly Muslim village. And at the beginning of the pilot, we had to give out the cards for which they were going to get their basic income. And all the young women were wearing veils, right? And they had to have their picture taken for the card, and they had to go into a separate house and only be seen by women, etc., etc. And then after about 9 months, when I revisited that particular village, I said to one of my Indian colleagues, who's now chair of BIAN, incidentally, I said to him, have you noticed a change here in this village? And he said, no. I said, yes, there's a big change. And I told him, I said, none of the young women are wearing veils. And eventually we called some young women across and we said, excuse us, but why is this change taking place? And they were nervous. timid, as you would expect, not like an international student like yourself. And eventually they said, well, before we had to do what the elders told us to do. Now we have our basic income, we decide for ourselves. And an even more powerful story occurred in Namibia. I went down at the end of the pilot, went to the village, and I called some young women across, teenagers. And I said, what's the best thing about having had a basic income all this time? What's the best thing for you? And they giggled and they didn't want me to answer and so on. And then one of them said, well, before, when the men came down from the fields with their money at the end of the month, we had to say yes. Now we have our basic income, we can say no. That is, I've mentioned it in the book, but it's the sort of thing that happens. We have found in pilots that women are moving out of abusive relations when they have their basic income because they don't fear their freedom so much. And they can break out of abusive relationships. Now, of course, it's not going to solve all the things. I'm not pretending that that's the solution. Of course, you need institutions, you need legislation, etc., etc. But empowering people this way is an important empowerment. So I think you should be optimistic. For me, it's a highly feminist action and private policy. But
Because
thank you for your 3 questions. Good question.
Because money is power. Money is power. And that's really what this is all about. That's what basic income is all about. It is about empowering the least advantaged people in the country and in the world at the individual level. So they can then use that collectively or individually. Power, the difference in society when people have that real power is incredible. All right, if somebody has a question they can ask in 15 seconds and Guy can answer in 45, you can ask. Medha, can you do that or no?
Yeah, I just have a small point to make. First of all, when Professor Standing said that unpaid work is the most important, the first example which came to my mind was women who do not work, who are primary caretakers and work as housewives. I think that is very important because in some way contributions towards their basic income would help us to evaluate their contribution in the GDP of the country, which I think has been an important question in feminist economics for over the years. How do we evaluate how much is their contribution? And I think through some sort of modeling, we can do that. I just had to make this point.
Yeah, well, let me quickly answer in the spirit you raised it, which is actually the care work to which you're referring is work. It's work. And there are what are called satellite national accounts. And the satellite national accounts in many countries show that the imputed economic value of so-called unpaid care work by women is greater than the value of labor in manufacturing and all non-financial services in advanced capitalist economies. So it's not a minor matter. And basic income is a modest step to recognize that this form of work should be properly compensated and recognized in our economies and in our societies. And I'm glad you've raised it as important because it's a point I feel very, very strongly about. We need to value all forms of work, particularly care work.
Okay, thank you so much, Guy.